Hi, good evening everybody, and welcome to Glassdoor's Views from the Frontline webinar. It's great to see that so many of you have been able to join us tonight. We know that there are many Zoom invites these days, but we really value the chance to talk to you all tonight and that you've joined us this evening. So normally around this time of year, we'd be able to invite many of you to come and visit our Glassdoor night shelters, see our services in action. Obviously with COVID, that's not possible this year. So we wanted to give you an opportunity to come together and meet online some of our colleagues at Glassdoor that are working quite literally on the front line. So I'll invite colleagues to introduce themselves now.
Hi everyone, I'm Matthew. I'm one of the operations managers with Glassdoor.
Hi, I'm Geoff. I'm the other operations manager for Glassdoor as well.
Hi, I'm Alex. I'm one of the caseworkers at Glassdoor.
Hi, I'm Gemma. I'm also a caseworker for Glassdoor.
That's great. Thank you, everyone. So before we get started, I'm going to give you some of my reflections from the past year, just a few bits of housekeeping. There will be a chance to formally ask questions at the end. Thank you to everyone who submitted their questions in advance. I know we've had lots in. We'll aim to cover some of those during the main body, and some of them we'll be able to come back to at the Q&A. There's also a Q&A function on Zoom, so do post your questions as they arrive through the night, and we'll endeavour to answer as many of them as we can. We're scheduled to finish at 7:45 sharp. Please don't worry, we will finish on time. If you do need to leave early for any reason, that's absolutely fine. We're recording this session and we will circulate the recording afterwards. So yeah, no concerns there. So before I sort of start talking you through in more detail the past year, I wanted to take this opportunity to thank every one of you who are here tonight. Not only on behalf of me, but also our guests, our whole staff team, our trustees, for all of the wonderful support that you've given us. Many of you have supported us for a number of years. Some of you are new to Glassdoor, but thank you from the bottom of our hearts for everything that you've done for us. And as the evening unfolds, you'll get a sense of more of that. But just, yeah, I wanted to stop and acknowledge that before we start. So it's about a year or so since COVID first hit and first started posing some of the challenges that it has for us. And as I've really been kind of reflecting over the past year, it made me really stop and think about quite how much we've achieved. So, you know, back in around this time last year, our first priority was looking at in our night shelters, which many of you will know was our normal model of accommodating people over the winter. We've been running church night shelters for 20 years. Last winter, we'd managed to open 5 night shelter circuits with around 170 people every night. And so our first priority was keeping those people that were in our shared sleeping spaces safe. So instigating, you know, new policies and procedures to keep them all safe. So we, you know, thank goodness managed to achieve that. Very soon afterwards, it was a case of trying to negotiate access to the government's hotels. So before the Everyone In scheme, which was the scheme by which government moved people that were rough sleeping into hotels, before it was even officially launched, we'd already managed to secure places in the GLA, the Greater London Authority's hotels. Then we had the big challenge of how do we move people from our night shelters safely, you know, get them all tested, move them into those hotels. So that was another huge challenge that we faced. Next, it was, you know, what do we do about our office? How do our caseworkers keep on seeing guests? How do we, you know, almost overnight implement a whole range of, again, procedures to keep everybody safe? And it's worth saying that where other services were closing left, right and centre, you know, a number of, well, as well as during the lockdown, a lot of the sort of public spaces that our guests would usually use, so things like libraries, you know, train stations, even McDonald's, you know, while they were all closing during the lockdown, so were many of the services that are normally available for homeless people. So there were less and less services available, and we felt it really important that we had to stay open throughout the period, and we managed to do that. Our caseworkers carried on seeing guests every week over the last year. You know, there was no point at which we had to close. Our caseworkers continued supporting the guests that had moved from the night shelters into the government hotels. Usually, you know, we have our very busy winter season that finishes in April, and then normally the summer is the slightly quieter period when it's a chance for people to reflect, you know, rest, for us to start planning for the following year. And while our caseworkers do continue meeting people normally in our partner day centres, this year we suddenly had a whole cohort of guests that had moved into the government hotels that they continued to support over that period. So again, just you know, a far greater onus on us to continue supporting our guests. Soon after that, we had the challenge of, well, what's next winter going to look like? You know, already by the summer, the government was, you know, starting to indicate that shared spaces just weren't going to be a reality in winter. Night shelters like our normal church sort of communal night shelters were just not going to be possible. And we'd have to totally adapt what we do this winter. So I went back and worked it out from the dates. In under 10 weeks, we adapted and developed a whole new service model. We negotiated an agreement for the 2 hostels in Westminster with our partners LHA, and you'll hear all about that later on in the call. We adapted our activities in the churches so we could still make use of our wonderful volunteers and the wonderful spaces to offer people dinner. Again, you'll hear all about that tonight. But yeah, really extraordinary efforts all round to turn that around so quickly. And then, of course, we're halfway through the winter, which again, in so many ways, has had extra challenges with COVID. So, you know, I'm focusing very much here on the challenges because in a minute you'll hear all about the wonderful opportunities and the wonderful successes that we've had. But I suppose I wanted to reflect here on how resilient really we've been and how adaptable we've been at being able to overcome those challenges. And as I stopped to think, you know, what were the reasons that we've been so successful? You know, there were 2 main things. The first one comes back to the original point that I made at the start, thanking all of you, our amazing supporters. You know, we quite simply couldn't have done it without your financial support. A number of you have supported us for many years, and this year decided to, you know, significantly increase that support. Others of you have, you know, have joined the fold this year that you really felt you wanted to respond in the pandemic. You wanted to be doing something to support people experiencing homelessness, and you know, it's only thanks to that extreme generosity that we've been able to do everything that we have, and it's been a, you know, a much more costly model. And then the second main factor has been the Glassdoor team. I cannot say enough how absolutely incredible the staff team are, how they've adapted, how they've been dedicated and committed to our guests. You know, back when we were making decisions about what to do over the summer, whether we could stay open, the first thing the casework team said was, you know, what do you mean, can we stay open? Our guests need us now more than they've ever needed us before. You know, there's no question that we would close. So just, you know, that attitude, the hard work that all the people here on this call and the whole team have put in has been what has led to so many successes. I won't talk for too much longer now because I know you're all itching to hear from the front line. So I think I'll leave it there for now with my reflections. And at this point, I will hand it over to Matt.
Hi, everyone. I'm Matt. I'm just going to share my screen for a second here. Yeah. Lovely. Hi, everyone. It's nice to, well, not see you all, but at least know that you're there and listening. So I'm going to speak a little bit about our hostels that we opened up this year and for the first time. But just in case you're new to Glassdoor, to give you a little bit of history. There we are. What we did in the past, and what our traditional model was a rolling church-based night shelter. So that would be 7 churches in an area welcoming guests 1 day a week each. So Glassdoor staff would be there to manage up to 35 guests each evening. Volunteers cooked, served, and shared meals with guests. Staff stayed overnight to ensure the safety of guests and the building. That would be everyone sleeping essentially on the floor with a mat in the same room. So men and women separated, but all in a church hall. And guests depart in the morning after breakfast. And generally shelters ran from November to April. With our last season, we had 5 circuits. So that's 5 night shelters every night of the week in 4 different boroughs, our BKC being the borough with 2 shelters. That wasn't possible this year. There were several challenges. I mean, COVID is the short answer, but the challenges presented by COVID is basically a shared airspace. You can imagine 30 people sleeping a meter apart in a room. That the transmission risk of that. Shared bathrooms, again, if you imagine any church you've ever been in, there's unlikely to be 30 bathrooms. And then, of course, the general risk of transmission when you have so many people in a building. Government guidance also was unclear for a long time, longer than we would have needed to make a decision. And then eventually was very restrictive. As a result, there's been a massive reduction in the number of emergency beds nationwide for people experiencing homelessness. And we ended up pivoting to a hostel model so that we were able to meet some of the need that is out there and is out there today. So a little bit about our hostel service. It's a low support needs hostel, or both hostels are low support needs hostels for people experiencing homelessness. Each guest receives a private room, a shared bathroom, and 3 meals a day. Each of these hostels has 2 full-time caseworkers. Alex is one of those caseworkers. So they are there to support guests in their move-on options, whether as well, housing, ID, other services that they need to kind of move on with their life, and that's what they're there for. Guests are free to work, to leave, to exercise, and there is a curfew every night, much very similar to the night shelter if you with us in past years. So toiletries, laundry facilities, snacks, entertainment materials, and Wi-Fi are all provided at the hostels. We do our best to try to have a very inclusive one-stop shop service so that guests don't need to be accessing other services, and basically lessen the transmission risk for our guests. So Glassdoor staff are on site with these hostels 24/7 to address guest concerns and support them as they're needed. So how does a guest access our hostel service? Guests can be referred via Glassdoor caseworker or one of our few partner organizations. They have an assessment form that's filled out beforehand. So this is part of the us requiring to have a low support needs hostel. It's important for us to know a little bit about our guests before they come to us. But we do everything possible for it to not be restrictive and not to be exclusionary. We do everything we can to allow our guests to come to us, and so that they have an emergency space to sleep when they need it. Guests are suitable. Guests who are suitable are placed on our waiting list, and when a space is available, guests are contacted with directions just like they would be in the night shelter. The referral process, we close it when we have 50 people on the waiting list. It's effectively been closed since around the new year. We've opened up briefly for example, just for women for about 2 days and then closed it again. So you might be wondering what the hostels look like. Here's a few quick pictures. So this is a single room. These are former hostels, so there might be 2 beds in the room, there might be 4 beds in the room, but there's only ever 1 person in the room. Each room has a bed, a desk, a sink, storage, and a window. So they're all pretty similar. This is one of the smaller rooms, so they're relatively nice. and comfortable for our guests. So there's the dining hall in the basement. Both buildings are quite similar, and that's where the majority of our casework happens. That area is closed to guests. There is no communal space, unfortunately, that being because of the transmission risk. Guests for meals get their meals in the cafeteria and take it up to the room where they eat. They also, of course, have laundry on site free of charge for guests. So COVID health and safety is basically the first thing out of my mind every morning. So how we built our service to mitigate the risk from the ground up. We've had some advantage there where other services had to adapt on the fly. We had a short time, but 10 weeks from when we first saw these properties to when we opened to build the service and make sure that it's as safe as possible. So like almost everywhere else in the UK, PPE, social distancing, and hand washing mandatory as much as we can possibly ensure. We cohort bathroom facilities. So even though they are shared bathrooms, we cohort people together as a household, 3 to 1, so that people are isolated from other people on their floor and there's not a whole lot of cross-contamination possibilities. Meal times are staggered and meals are eaten alone. So we have, for example, 4 floors in a hostel. Each one has a half-an-hour slot to come down for the meal, so there's not a line of 20 people waiting for dinner. We ask all guests to self-isolate when they come into the hostel for the first time or take a test. So thanks to asymptomatic testing that's available in all 32 London boroughs now, we're able to offer a test to any guest who wants one. So if they test negative, then their isolation ends. If not, if they decide they don't want to take a test, they can isolate for 10 days and we'll support them to do that. We check daily temperatures daily and monitor their wellness for other symptoms and make sure that everyone's feeling well. So there's constant contact with or checking in with guests. We of course have increased cleaning, and we also fog the building once a month, which leaves 30 days of residual protection. So it's the same product that's used on TfL services, for example. And then we have the backup of mobile testing of suspected cases by the NHS. So, for example, if a guest has a temperature, which I've come to find out is quite common, people have fevers that are totally unrelated to COVID. So they'll come out immediately, test that person while they're self-isolated, and then we get a result quite rapidly, so we can ensure the safety of everyone. And very recently, we've instituted, or just this coming Sunday, we'll start regular COVID-19 testing. So twice a week, just like our staff are now doing, and like NHS staff do, that our guests are able to test themselves twice a week with a rapid test, just to ensure that we don't have any kind of asymptomatic spread of COVID-19 in our hostels. Just a quick note on where our hostels are. They're both in Westminster, but that is as exact as we can be. Unfortunately, there have been security issues at some of the GLA hotels and other places. So for the safety of our guests and staff, we're quite coy about where they are. So who our guests are. Our guests are for, this year have been from 47 different countries, 25 from the, or 16% rather from the UK, 68%, sorry, 43% from the EU, and 41% from the rest of the world. And those numbers are a little skewed, partly by the partners that we have for referrals. So one of those partners, a major one, is Westminster Outreach Teams. And Westminster specifically has quite a bit of European people experiencing homelessness. So that those numbers are not representative of the London homelessness population, but it is a representative of who's accessing our service. I don't know what's with me tonight. Age ranges are from 18 to 67. And some of our positive outcomes so far, and this is just February 12th, is 16 people have been housed from the hostels, 7 have been put into employment, 6 have their EU settled status applied for, 12 have received benefits, 10 bank accounts, 6 have gotten ID, 8 have had financial outcomes, maybe a bank account, and 19 have had health outcomes. And on top of that health outcomes, we'll be logging 52 guests this week were able to access COVID-19 vaccinations. So there's quite a few outcomes there coming down the pipeline. A few other statistics. So we have 101 beds across our 2 sites. Glassdoor at the moment accounts for 25% of all emergency bed spaces in London. It's very, on one hand, it's excellent that we're able to provide so many beds. On the other hand, it's also quite sad that there aren't more beds. There needs to be more beds. We have a waiting list with many people that could use help. So far, 158 people total have accessed our hostels for at least one night, and we have it between a 96 and 100% attendance rate. So with 100 people's lives, there's always somebody who has a family emergency, etc. But we're basically full all the time. And 30 of our 101 spaces are for women. If you count up each full bed, we've had over 8,000 daily bed spaces filled so far since November 16th. And like I mentioned earlier, our waiting list has been closed since December for men. So we've had tons of challenges this year, as you can imagine, as we all have with COVID. So the biggest challenge has been mitigation by design and constantly adapting to the kind of ever-changing threat of COVID and making sure that we have the safest possible environment for our guests. So a lot of the things that I talked about earlier, like the fogging and testing, are recent additions as soon as they became possible. It wasn't possible for us to offer testing when we started in November. It is now, so we're constantly adapting and updating our procedures. It's also a new model for us. We have plenty of experience with night shelters, but this is the first time we've ever run hostels. So building a service that meets the needs of our guests in a COVID environment, ensuring dignity of our guests so that they still have autonomy and agency in their lives, and keeping everyone safe at all times has been our biggest challenge. But luckily, the team has met those challenges, and I'm really proud of what we've built as a team. That's all I've got for now. So on next to Alex Norris.
Thank you very much, Matt. Hello, my name is Alex. I'm one of the caseworkers at our hostels, where we have just over or just under 50 beds, I think, where I'm working. So I'm going to be giving you a brief overview of the work that we're doing at the hostels, giving you an idea of who's staying there, and explaining the changes that we've had to make to our current model. I'll try not to repeat what Matt has already told you. And if you have any particular questions about what I've said, please feel free to leave them below, and I'll be very happy to answer them as best I can. So Matt has already mentioned some of the changes that we've had to make. Obviously, the provision that is available this year with the hostels is vastly different to what we've been able to provide previously in night shelters. So as Matt kind of explained, what we know is that this year, people aren't having to move around a circuit of night shelters. They're able to remain in a static location, have a private room with 4 walls, a lock on their door, and access to laundry facilities, a toilet, a shower, whenever they need it. It provides a safe space for people to be able to self-isolate if they need to. And it means that someone isn't having to worry about, for example, where their next meal is coming from, where they're going to sleep that night, whether they can charge their phone or have somewhere safe to store their bag. And what this has meant is that we've seen a really good engagement from the guests who are staying at our hostels. Obviously, when you are in a shelter and you're having to get up very early and leave, often in the cold and the rain, trying to find somewhere to be before you can return the following evening, it's very difficult to work on a future plan. Even when you're in a really dire situation, it can be difficult to imagine kind of what needs to happen in the future beyond the immediate need of how do I stay warm, how do I find food, how do I kind of just manage today. What's been so great about the hostels is guests are able to really plan ahead. So a lot of the work that we've been doing has been kind of getting some building blocks in place so that people can move into accommodation by the end of it. Now, what I mean by building blocks is helping people kind of get their lives together so that they have everything they need so they can move into long-term accommodation. This can be a whole range of things, from sort of quite easy things like opening a bank account to things that are a bit harder, like stabilizing someone's immigration status, finding employment. It could be accessing benefits. It could be sorting out a physical or mental health problem that's stopping someone from moving into accommodation. And only once you have these things in place can someone realistically move on out of the hostel and into long-term accommodation. To give you an idea of the kind of people that we're seeing, Matt already showed you the demographics, but we're seeing a lot of people who lost their jobs during the COVID pandemic. That seems to be one of the highest reasons for homelessness, at least that I've encountered since I've been working there. A lot of people who were in kind of informal work, as sort of perhaps without a contract, or just short-term work, which meant they weren't necessarily eligible for universal credit when it ended, has meant that people have had to leave their homes, in many cases have ended up rough sleeping, and are now in kind of urgent need of being able to find a source of income before they can get back into accommodation. One thing that we're finding is many people really want to work, but as you can imagine, at the moment, opportunities to get back into employment are extremely limited. And of course, if that's your only option to getting some form of income, for example, if you're from a European country and don't automatically have entitlement to benefits, that's kind of your real hope of being able to move out of our hostels. The hostels offer a real sense of community, and despite the measures that we've had to put in place, for example, the social distancing, the mask wearing, there's nonetheless a real sense of people being in it together, and that's really shared among the staff, the guests, the volunteers, everyone who plays a part in Glassdoor. The LHA staff have been really helpful, have been very flexible in the way that they've worked, and this has meant that people feel very secure in where they're staying. They feel able to engage in casework, and they feel like hopefully finally they have some hope for the future. I'll always remember seeing one lady who, when she came to the hostel the first time, literally broke down in tears for several minutes because she just never she hadn't expected to be taken care of in that way, to have food available for her when she needed it, to have night staff there if she had any problems, and to have a private room with a lock on the door just for her. So we're seeing again and again people who would otherwise be out on the streets, having some decent accommodation, often for the first time in months. We're seeing some people who've been rough sleeping, not just since the pandemic, but even longer, and are now choosing to engage and kind of look at a long-term plan to ending their homelessness. Just to give you a couple of examples of some of the people we've been able to help since we opened. I was working with one lady who was over 60. She'd been homeless for a long time, mostly staying with friends and family for kind of short periods at a time. She'd been able to do some very casual work here and there, mostly cleaning, but never earning enough to be able to pay her own way. When the pandemic hit last year, she was asked to leave because people didn't really feel it was safe to keep accommodating her, and she ended up staying at our night shelter. With Glassdoor support, she's been able to access benefits. She's opened her own bank account. She's been able to stabilize her immigration status by applying to the EU settlement scheme, and she moved into her own property just last week. So it's these kind of outcomes that we're really working towards, and that really make everything we do so worthwhile. And sort of as Matt mentioned, the demographics are so broad. So we're seeing people from a whole range of ages, nationalities, genders, ethnicities, all different walks of life, many of whom have become homeless for just all kinds of reasons, whether it be loss of job, loss of a bereavement, for example, in some cases breakdown of a relationship, and just an ever-growing list of reasons that we're still seeing day by day as more and more people come to stay with us. Another young lady who I've been working with since the hostels opened came to us because of a breakdown in her marriage, and she was kind of initially was feeling quite unsure about going things alone. She's found it very beneficial being in the hostel because it's given her a stable foundation upon which she can realistically start rebuilding things. So she's engaging in a college course, and I spoke to her tutor not long ago, and she said there'd been a big uptick in her attendance and her engagement since she came to the hostel. She's in receipt of benefits, and she's just been accepted for a placement in supported accommodation, which she's hoping to move into next week, which again is another fantastic outcome, which may not have been possible without the hostel provision. And I'll just kind of mention it one more time, because I think it's worth repeating that what the hostel offers, which is so invaluable, is a foundation of stability. And that stability gives people the time and the security to think about the future, to engage in casework, to get the things they need, whether it's ID, income, engagement in other health services, and that allows them to move on and gives them the best chance to find something that's appropriate for them and that they're likely to be able to sustain. So that's the kind of long-term positive impacts that the hostels are having. I think that's pretty much it from me. But if you do have any questions about anything I've said, please do put them in the Q&A box below, and I'll be very happy to answer them later. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Alex. I'm Geoff. I'm one of the operations managers. I would normally focus on our winter night shelters, but in light of the pandemic, we've been looking to see where I could focus on our other resources. So beyond the hostels, we wanted to look to see how we could support our guests. One of the ideas we came up with, which was in part due to the fact that our night shelters had food for some guests that weren't staying overnight. So we looked to see if we could offer some support in that way. What we came up with was the idea of a dinner service. We had to be sure that we would be able to operate this in a very safe manner to make sure that we weren't putting any of our guests at further risk from COVID, and that had to be with including our volunteers who are supporting us as well. So we launched this in the beginning of November. I'll just show some slides to give you a brief overview of it. So our dinner service was launched in November. I'll just start off with a few quotes from a couple of guests. And then we'll go into the detail about what we serve. The dinner service, we have a warm, hot, nutritious meal for the guests. It's also a place where the caseworkers can work with the guests and provide information, and Gemma will later go into more detail about that, the casework that's on offer. The guests also have access to other resources. Every guest is asked to wear a mask as they come in. There's strict COVID safety measures, and that is one of the requirements that they will need to go through. And they're offered the masks to take away as well as hand sanitizer and other products, sanitary products, toiletries, clothing vouchers, and clothing items as well, which has been particularly important during this very cool snap that we had. It's a great place for somewhere warm to sit, eat, and speak to others. As Lucy mentioned earlier, many of the services have been closed. Some of the services where guests might have normally gone, such as libraries and other daytime services. So this has been a vital resource where the guests can have some respite coming in into the warmth. It's also been a place where external services can visit. Now, that has been limited by the lockdown, but we have had the alcohol dependency, some resources they will be coming in to speak to some of our guests, and there is the hope that we can have some guests come in to look at, see if they can support our guests with dental work as well. That is currently restricted with the lockdown, but we'll hope that we can do that before the end. So just in terms of to give you some ideas of our our guests. We have served over 5,000 meals so far in total. Of those, there's 240 different guests that have attended across our 4 different services. Many more have benefited as well. That hasn't just been the guests who've been coming through the doors. There have been enough food for friends and families to be taken away by guests who've got access to the service. Broken down across the services, it's 248 guests. Our most popular one has been in Kensington and Chelsea, and we've also had it operating in Hammersmith and Fulham, and Wandsworth and in Richmond. They're the 4 boroughs where we've currently had our night shelters. As Matt mentioned, we had 5 of those in previous years, so they've been able to support our guests in those boroughs. At least a third of our guests are street homeless. That's actually almost half of those. That is a question that we do ask our guests when they do register for the service. But many of our guests do skip this question, so we expect the figure would be higher. Many of our guests would prefer not to say this, and we don't ask this or state that's no stipulation. And any guest is welcome to come through the doors as long as they abide by the COVID safety measures that we ask. Guests may also be in other situations. They may have owners, but they might actually have somewhere to stay, or they may be vulnerable house. So we're able to support those guests who might be on the peripherals and struggling to access food or other resources, even though they might actually have a roof over their head. Now, we wouldn't be able to do this without the great support of our volunteers, which has always been one of the backbones of the organisations. With this, we've been able to draw on the resources from our volunteers, from our 32 teams. As Matt mentioned, we would have had the 5 night shelters. So with that, and with them being roaming night shelters, we had a number of volunteers from there. So we've had to reduce that significantly for everyone's safety and having volunteers operate an absolute minimum. But that's still approximately 370 who've been supporting us over the course of this season so far. So what they do is they prepare a home-cooked, fabulous meal. They might not necessarily do that on site. That has been dependent on whether the venues are able to offer the kitchen as well. But if they're not able to, there's resources in hand for that to be brought in. So not all the volunteer teams are on site, but we do have minimum volunteers to make sure that we can operate the service safely. So the volunteers are much smaller, with less guest interaction, and that's for everyone's safety, which has been a downside that we have to do that to minimise the interaction for everyone's welfare. But the guests have been really appreciative of what they do have there. It's also been an opportunity for us to engage the teams that would have normally been involved, and that can safeguard the future of the night shelters if we're in a position to do those in the future. So everyone has to abide by strict COVID safety requirements that are in place. So that includes now if any volunteer must wear a mask and a visor. All guests must wear masks when they're moving around the venues, sanitize their hands, and we will conduct some safety questions before the guests access the service. As Matt mentioned, we do hope to be running out as well COVID tests to guests, which will be optional in the very near future as they are now available. I think I should point out that we have, with the dinner service, been below capacity over some of them, and that has been in part because it's been quite difficult to promote the service whilst the other services have been closed. So there's been benefits to that we've been able to support the guests who have come through the doors very well, and we have been actively promoting the service. In good part recently, we've been looking to see how we can open that up. We had initially looked to see that it was registration only for the guests, and we've opened that up to say that anybody is welcome who turns up at the doors. And with that, we've been seeing an increase in numbers over January and February. We have been sending out the flyers, which have been gone out to the volunteers and the venues and other services in the area. So the word has been getting around, which has been slower. I'll just highlight one of those that does, so it shows how the guests can access the service, and we'll also give a map of where each venue is. So just some of the benefits of the dinner services. we've been able to be consistent and reliable throughout the pandemic. So we've been open since the beginning of November, and we will remain so until April. That's included over the Christmas and New Year period, particularly when a lot of other services were closed. Normally, Crisis would be stepping it over that period, but they were unable to do so due to the pandemic. So we were able to keep a consistent service to our guests. And we've always been able to say yes to guests as well. We haven't as yet had to turn any of our guests away. It's also been an opportunity for our caseworkers to engage with some guests who might otherwise have missed the support network, particularly with a lot of the daytime services closed. That's been a vital line for some of our guests. One of the other benefits of it has been that our staff have been able to engage and be able to build good connections with the guests. That might not have normally happened in the night shelter environment, because that tends to be quite a busy, frenetic environment. And with this, it's been an opportunity for our staff to engage, and also to relay any concerns to the caseworkers so they can actively engage with them. And Gemma can go into more detail about that later. We've also been able to provide takeaway meals because some of our guests are very worried about coming inside to anywhere for obvious reasons. So we've been able to offer that service to our guests who would prefer not to come inside, but are in need of food as well. So they get a great takeaway meal if they're not inside the venue. So we've not exceeded our maximum numbers, but it means that we've not had to turn anybody away, which is great, particularly in this time of need. So I'll just finish off with a few of the quotes from some of the guests. And with that, I will hand you over to Gemma, who can give you a bit more about the caseworking service at the dinner services.
Hi everyone. As Geoff introduced, I am Gemma and I'm one of the caseworkers here at Glassdoor. I'm based at a morning drop-in at the Vineyard Community Centre, which is in Richmond. The Vineyard Community Centre is one of our partner daytime services that Glassdoor work with. So they offer a place for the homeless and vulnerably housed to have access to food, showers, and support from organisations like us at Glassdoor. In conjunction with the daytime drop-in, the Vineyard has helped Glassdoor provide its dinner service in Richmond, which I attend. This has been different from the night shelters, but I've really felt that the Glassdoor staff and volunteers have been able to retain that same positive atmosphere when giving out food and drinks to our guests. And they've also, as Geoff said, been able to get to know them on a much more intimate level. At the Richmond dinner service, there's certainly familiar faces who also attend the morning drop-in services. There's a mixture of guests, those who are vulnerably housed and those who are street homeless. Those who are vulnerably housed really appreciate that social element of both the dinner service and the morning drop-in, but also know that if they do need any help with benefits or accessing food banks, etc., we're there to assist them. With some of the street homeless people that I work with in Richmond, they are deeply entrenched, rough sleepers. Some have been on the streets for over 20 years, and usually they don't want to engage with our services. But this year I found that a few have definitely been attending our dinner service. This is absolutely amazing and really promising, because it shows that they feel comfortable in accepting this kind of support. And I've been able to build up relationships which hopefully will result in other kinds of engagement. For example, example I really want to share with you, there is a guest who has been known to our services for many years and has been rough sleeping for close to 15 years. Significant mental health issues, alcohol dependency. We at Glassdoor have really tried to work with him in the past, but this guest, due to their lack of engagement, it really has been difficult to make any progress. But this year, since we opened the dinner service in October, this guest actually began to attend regularly, which was absolutely wonderful to see, and really enabled us to involve other organisations and kind of signpost them to like mental health, for example, and really work together to make actual progress. So previously, this particular guest had refused all accommodation that was ever offered to him, or abandoned that accommodation within 1 or 2 days. now I'm really pleased to say that this guest is an emergency accommodation and has not abandoned the property. And he is on a list to be provided with 24-hour supported accommodation. And due to his continued engagement with us, we're really hopeful that this will ensure he has the best possible opportunity to recover and engage with all the necessary services that he requires. He's had continued access to our warm evening meals provided by Glassdoor, and still attends our usual day services at the Vineyard, which has enabled him, for example, this morning to have his mental health assessment. So in this particular example, the dinner service and drop-ins have worked really, really well for this guest, as he was enabled to engage at a level that made him feel comfortable and know that he was able to get the necessary help that he needed. Another example that I wanted to share with you is, whilst at the dinner service, I met a young couple who'd been previously living on their canal boat, but unfortunately due to flooding, it made it completely inhabitable. I was informed by the dinner service management that they really didn't want to ask for help, as they were very independent and kind of wished to solve their own problems. And I think they just never thought that they'd be in this situation, which has happened to a lot of people, and especially during COVID. But at the dinner service, as Geoff said, and it's more informal, and I didn't want anyone to think that, you know, they needed to speak to me, but I just introduced myself and started an ordinary conversation, remembering that everyone is just people and we are just building relationships. So I just kind of built up a rapport, got to know them, talking about things, what they liked, what their situation was. And they explained that, you know, the young man, for example, just lost his job due to COVID. And they really opened up, but in a kind of conversational level. And just when they were about to leave dinner service, I did say, you know, I am available at the morning drop-in. So if they did want to come and see me, that would be great. And I did offer some advice about the EU settlement scheme as well, which I would be able to help them with. And then just because I'd spoken to them over dinner and like having a coffee, they were really positive, and they actually came to see me that morning, which was fantastic. And they'd had brought with them all the documents that they needed to do their EU settlement scheme application, which was just really great. And I did what they had told me when they came back as well, is that they felt reassured and they weren't embarrassed. Like, I think a part of them was maybe embarrassed that they'd got themselves into the situation, but I kind of had just been like, look, this is what could happen to anybody, and I'm just here to help, which I would do regardless of the situation. So just through that conversation at the dinner service, I was able to gain their trust, and it was really great. And they even signed up to the Glassdoor Hostel, which they got a place at as well. So it just kind of moved everything in the right direction for them. And when they had got the place in the hostel, they came back and saw me at the Vineyard just to kind of let me know how they were getting on, and really appreciated how they were retaining their own independence as well. I was just there as a means to support them, but just let them know that I am there for whatever they need. I really think that it's extremely important for us caseworkers to build this trust with our guests, because essentially we're there to support them, but to help them turn their lives around, and their dignity and their agency is always essential and at the forefront. But homelessness has many faces. You may not think that someone is facing hardship, and those people do have preconceived notions of what that looks like. But you know, the pandemic as well has also led a lot of people who never thought they'd be in this situation, faced with the fact that this is their reality. And I just feel that the dinner service and the drop-in services that we have at Glassdoor, you know, are a great way for anyone who becomes in this position, or vulnerably housed or homeless, to have access to the support they need. And as Alex has said, that there's many things that we need to enable the stability that they have at the end, to retain that, to be able to just have that long-term accommodation and have that with minimal support in the end. So yeah. And as Alex said as well, if you have any questions about dinner service or case working at the drop-in, please put any questions in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Gemma, and thanks everyone else as well. I'm mindful of leaving plenty of time. I'm sure you've all got burning questions to ask our panelists. So I won't spend too much time, but I just want to very briefly talk about the future, the near-term future, and also forward to next winter. So our hostels were initially due to close middle of April. So the current projects will still close as they stand during the middle of April, but we've actually decided to extend one of the two hostels until the beginning of June. The reason for that was, as Alex has highlighted, there are many different ways to help people on their path out of homelessness. For some people it can be a slightly quicker journey, and for others, for various reasons, it can take a bit longer. So given the position that we were in financially, and thanks to all of the support from everybody, we felt that actually extending one of the hostels for those 2 months would just provide that extra bit of vital time needed for some of our guests. So that's what we're sort of looking at in the near term. And then in terms of planning for next winter, we actually had a strategy session last week with all staff and trustees to try and look forward to what next winter might look like. Of course, no one's got a crystal ball, and there's still a lot of uncertainty around COVID. So we're hoping to, in about the next month or so, we'll have a bit more news about the scenario planning. Again, like last summer, for this winter, we're planning for a number of different scenarios, and we'll have a bit more information on that. You've heard from Alex about many of the advantages of the hostel model and stability that's brought, but also the hostels are much more expensive. So it's around about over 3 times more expensive per guest to run the hostel model compared to the night shelter model in churches. So again, those are the sorts of things that we're just having to look at now. We're going to be doing everything we can to try to make sure that some form of church night shelters can open this winter. So as I say, watch this space, and there'll be more on that in due course. Right, I think at this point we will hand over to Ian to talk us through the Q&A.
Well, thank you very much, Lucy, and thank you to everyone for sending your questions through both tonight and in advance as well. We've had plenty, so just a note to our panelists, we've had really good questions, but do try and be as brief as you can. I know it's tricky because there are some complex questions here, but we'll kick off with a question here around the funding for the hostels. So how were the hostels created? What's the funding there? And someone asked specifically about government funding towards the hostels and whether or not there's been any government funding for that.
I'll take that one. So the simple answer is there's been some government funding. There have been various pots of money available to charities via Homeless Link. So Homeless Link is a charity. It's the umbrella organisation for homeless charities, and they do distribute grants on behalf of the MHCLG. So we have been able to access some funding towards our hostels from that source. The vast majority of the funding has been from private sources.
Thanks, Lucy. I guess a burning question for quite a few people, including Rona Black, is around guests being offered COVID vaccinations. I just wondered, perhaps, Matt, if you could talk about what's been happening in the hostels this week.
Yeah, so quite the success on Friday and on Monday this week. COVID-19 vaccinations were offered to all of our guests at our hostels. So 52 guests total have been vaccinated so far, and we expect there to be other rounds of vaccination. So it's been quite the success. It took a while for and some advocacy in the sector to have people experiencing homelessness added to group 2 of the COVID vaccination cycle. So it's finally happened.
Great, thank you. Anything else to add on vaccinations? Because I know we've had questions as well around vaccinations for staff and for the general support team as well.
Yeah, and at the same time, actually, but unrelated, our staff and volunteer team were also able to access vaccinations as part of social care workers. So I got my jab on Sunday, and so many of my colleagues have also.
Great, thank you. We've had plenty of questions as well about getting involved further. So what else can I do alongside perhaps giving money or generally around volunteering opportunities and wanting to be kept up to date. What I will just do very quickly is share my screen just to show you a great place on the Glassdoor website where you can go to find out more information about ways to get involved. We have a section here on the website which is top 10 ways to make a difference. And here you can find plenty of other ways that you can help this difficult winter. And on there, there's a link to where you can register to hear the latest updates about our volunteering opportunities. So do sign up there if you haven't already. And there's some other suggestions here about ways to get involved. And also do make sure you're on the Glassdoor mailing list as well. So again, you're hearing about those opportunities as soon as they come about. A question here from Ben Humphreys. Has the entitlement of EU guests to benefits changed since Brexit? Perhaps for our caseworkers there.
Yeah, I'll take that. So the EU settlement scheme, I'm not sure if everyone knows, but for those who are EEA nationals, due to Brexit, you have to apply to the scheme. If you've been living in the UK for longer than for 5 years or more, then you'd be applying for something called settled status, which is indefinite leave to remain, and you could retain all your rights and live in the UK completely unlimited. If you've been living in the UK for less than 5 years, then you can make the application for pre-settled status or leave to remain, which will enable you, which has a time limit of the 5 years, but once you've been in the country again, you would be able to apply for settled status. The difficulty is that, and also because of Brexit, you'd had to been in the UK before December 31st, 2020. So we have a lot of guests who obviously might not have known this. And with regards to benefits specifically, those who have settled status, they can access benefits. That's absolutely no problem. There is at the moment an existing court case for those who apply for universal credit with just pre-settled status. We are making those applications, but because we haven't got a final decision on it, there is back and forth and case by cases with the DWP. But we are making applications for those with pre-settled status as well. But the difficulty is ensuring that people actually know about the scheme, and especially we work with obviously vulnerably housed or street homeless people and it's not great marketing from the government's point of view for the EU settlement scheme. So a lot of people are getting missed, which is something that Glassdoor are really trying to ensure doesn't happen, and anyone coming through our doors, we're making sure get necessary EU settlement scheme advice.
Great, thank you, Gemma. And then I've had another question here. It's from Marissa. Marissa's asking, your services are open until April. What happens to guests thereafter? So we've obviously heard that one of the hostels is being extended, but yeah, what tends to happen as the winter services close, and how do you work with guests to support them thereafter? If perhaps, Alex, you might be able to say a word on this.
Yeah, sure. So as Lucy mentioned, some of our most vulnerable guests will have that extension into our second hostel. So we're mostly looking at prioritizing guests who have no recourse to public funds or who are especially vulnerable to COVID due to their age or due to their health. So that gives us a bit longer to work with them to try and find a long-term solution to their homelessness. For the remaining guests who are in the hostel in April, although we won't be able to continue accommodating them, we will still continue working with them in a caseworker capacity. So they'll be able to access our day centres, speak to their caseworker and continue finding ways to end their homelessness. And there are lots of different routes that can take. So it's not just a case of people leaving the hostels and then not receiving support from Glassdoor. We're here year round. So sort of regardless of people's situation, they will still be able to access support in some capacity through a caseworker.
Brilliant, thank you, Alex. So Monica's she's asked a question tonight around how our charity supports domestic violence victims. But Monica also said in advance that she's looking to set up a, I've lost the message here, would like to set up one link that helps direct people who might be in need of domestic violence advice. So perhaps we can pick that up with you offline, Monica. But perhaps one of our caseworkers might be able to say around how we support domestic violence victims, but also link in a little bit around how we do partner with other organisations as well as having in-house expertise.
So when we are working with a guest and they disclose domestic abuse of any sorts, we have we've had training and we've been on training with different organisations within London and nationally of where were the best places to link them in with, whether or not that's an IDFA, so an independent domestic violence advisor, somebody based at the council, and then we really assess what their needs would be and act in a trauma-informed way and make it very aware. So for example, with women, we would offer whether or not they'd be more comfortable in speaking to a female caseworker rather than a male caseworker. And in terms of the hostels, there's women-only floors, and we just ensure that all the different organisations actually they're getting the best support as possible by our signposting and working with them and building rapport and ensuring that they're felt safe as well. That's a main factor that come across those I've worked with who are survivors of domestic abuse as well. But mainly linking them in with the other organisations within London or nationally as well.
Thank you, Gemma. And a question for you, Matt, is there a maximum number of days guests can stay in one of the hostels? That's from Kathleen Duncan.
Yes and no. So we do have a limit of 28 days for guests to engage with our casework service. And to date, we haven't had to use that limit to ask anyone to leave. So we have very high engagement rates with our caseworkers. Of course, we will come to an end in both April and June, and that will be the end of our guest stay. But we wouldn't ask anyone to leave unless we had to.
Great. And perhaps one for you, Lucy. This one's from Sue Cook. Sue has asked, how much help have you had from corporates during this period? In the present climate, has corporate support increased or decreased generally?
Thank you. Yeah, interesting question, because I think we were expecting corporate support to decrease during the pandemic. Actually, it's increased. We've had not only financial support from existing companies and some new companies as well. We've also had loads of pro bono support, which has been fantastic and new this year in some ways. So we've had things like translation services of key documents. We translated all of the guest agreements into the main languages. We've had things like in our hostels, we were able to convert what would have been a public space into a private confidential case working space, thanks to a company donating sort of internal barriers to form separate rooms. And yeah, so we've had all sorts of different types of pro bono support.
Thank you. And one for you, Geoff. Perhaps you could answer a question that we had around what happens during the freezing weather that we've had recently for guests here. So perhaps a few words on sweat might be helpful.
Yeah, sure. Ian. What we would have normally had is our own emergency provision in the night shelters, where we would just stretched our capacity as much as we could do. We hope that we will be in a position where we can do that in the future. In the meantime, the local authorities, so it's borough specific, they have their own sweat provision, and in this COVID environment, what that's generally entailed has been additional bed spaces that have been made available in bed and breakfast. So that's where some guests have been supported during this very cold snap.
Brilliant, thank you, Geoff. A question from Matthew Skinner. Do we assist our guests to register with GPs?
Yes, that's been one of our priorities this season, especially because we know many people will be offered the vaccine through their GP first, unless they're in the hostel and have already, thankfully, been offered it. But yeah, it's very high on our priority list, and we have a couple of GPs who we work with quite closely, who are able to register our guests, even if they don't live in the specific area, and are well accustomed to working with people who are homeless or vulnerably housed, people who speak other languages, and who we're confident are offering a really good service to all of our guests.
Thank you. One of the questions we had in advance was from Tam Collins, and Tam said, how is the mental health status of guests compared to before COVID? Are they feeling even more hopeless and isolated? Gemma?
To be honest, in my experience, there hasn't been any real stark difference between the mental health and in terms of COVID and pre-COVID with the guests that I've been working with. They've raised the same concerns as everybody living during this time has raised, and their focus is still more on their situation, of whether or not that's their immigration status or their benefits, sorts of income, and their housing. That is still at the forefront. So whilst in terms of their mental health, COVID has made it more difficult with a lot of services closing, I haven't seen a correspondence or an increase for it, because the focus has always been on the other things that we support them with. That's my personal experience.
Brilliant, and perhaps time for one final question before we hand back to Lucy to wrap up for tonight. So I've got one here that says, what's the essential difference in Glassdoor's dinner service being able to stay operational inside versus other services that have moved to outside or that have not been able to open at all this last winter? Geoff, maybe?
Sure. Well, one of the prime things that we did was to conduct a COVID safety risk assessment at the beginning, before we looked at the numbers that we could allow, and that was a big factor in determining whether we could open, how many guests could come through the door, how many guests we could be sat safely. We could carry out social distancing, have a one-way systems in place and do all of that. So that was how we were able to look at that and conduct that safely. We also make sure that every guest who comes through the door, we do an assessment in terms of COVID questions, a temperature check for all guests, ask them to sanitize their hands and have their masks on before they come through the door.
Just to add to that answer as well, in terms of the difference, I suppose that the advantage Glassdoor has got is because we've got a large sort of seasonal workforce of staff. If one or two, have to self-isolate or off sick, for example, then we've still got the capacity to continue supporting the service. Some much smaller services are very reliant on a small number of people. So if one or two people are not available, then it's much harder for them to open. So that's, another reason that we're able to be quite resilient.
Brilliant. Well, I think that is all we've got time for by way of questions. Thank you to everyone that asked one either tonight or in advance. We will just double check through, make sure we have picked up everything that we could do, and if not, pick that up with you or try our best to. But yeah, over to you, Lucy. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, just in the last couple of minutes, a chance for me to reiterate our thanks to all of you for joining us for tonight, and also for all of your wonderful ongoing support. It's so valuable. Thanks to all my colleagues tonight for joining us. And I wanted to finish really with the words of our guests. We've recently done our guest survey. So we always conduct 2 surveys during the season, one at the middle and one at the end of the season. And we had a volunteer in today who was starting to process some of the responses that had come back. And she messaged me and she said, "I can't believe it. I've welled up so many times today just reading the comments that guests are making. It's so wonderful what you're offering." So I just wanted to share a couple of those comments to close. So the first one: "Mr. Neil helped me to have a room in Hammersmith last year when this COVID began and was so difficult for everybody. He was a treasure for me." And then the second one: "The Glassdoor have been very supportive to me. They are all very committed to their work." And hopefully everything that you've seen this evening sort of just demonstrates that commitment. So yes, thank you again for joining us, everybody. Have a wonderful evening, and we really, really hope to see you all in person very soon. Thank you.
Good evening.
Have a great night.